So welcome to my talk about GraphQL. I want to try to customize this presentation to the audience. So can I ask, who knows what's REST? What's a REST API? Okay, who is using a REST API actively in his business? Okay, who knows what GraphQL is? Not as many. Who is actively using a GraphQL API for a project? Okay, nobody? Oh, great, that's perfect. That's like my dream audience. So last year I had some free time at my hands, so I decided to look into web development again, and I looked into which technology stack to use, and I ended up using GraphQL for the communication between front end and back end. And today I want to share what I learned on that, and naturally I use Django for the back end, so I want to share how you can add GraphQL to a Django when you're already an existing Django developer, how to quickly add a GraphQL and use it with React or with Vue.js or with Angular or whatever. In this example, I'll be using Vue.js because it was the easiest to get started. Very short about myself. So I started doing online startups in 2008. So my first business was to import tailor-made shirts from China. And I made a little PHP application for that, which I'm not proud of. Then I've been doing some agency work for a while. And last year I started Borg.com, which is also where I learned about GraphQL. It's like a backup hosting platform. And I used mostly Django and Vue.js. Then some of my bigger open source projects. One is invoice to data. You can use it to give it a PDF invoice, and it gives you structured JSON data or whatever you need. So it's for accounting. Then Water is an open source backup client for desktops that you can run on a MacBook or a Linux. It's in Python, and it's a front end to Borg backup. So it's very high performance backup. And then I'm running a small startup group where you can, when you're a solo founder, you can join the group and you can discuss your marketing problems or your technical problems. So goals of my talk, it's mostly targeted at people who already know a little bit of Django, who are maybe using Django in a classical way or who are using it with a REST API. I want to start by introducing the GraphQL concepts. It's not very hard to understand, but you should still know it. And then we will look at a lot of code examples. We will look at how it looks in the Python backend, and we will look at how it looks in the JavaScript front end. And last, I will also be talking a little bit of how you can add authentication and security, because security in GraphQL is a little bit different from security where you have like access rights for one endpoint, but we'll come to that. So since GraphQL came out of Facebook. We have a few Facebook people here, but not in this room, I think. So they put it out maybe 4 years ago because they were running into a very specific problem or multiple problems, especially in the app. So they needed something new, and GraphQL was their way to solve the problems. So the first problem with REST is that you have to map all your actions to the HTTP methods that are available. So get, put, delete. There should be an E. And that can be very hard because, for example, in one of my first REST APIs that I made, I was building visualizations, and it was we had like some nested arguments, and our arguments was like a JSON dictionary. And how do you do this with a REST API? So we just did post JSON all the time. Then another problem that Facebook had. Usually you have many models that are connected in some way, and REST doesn't really allow you to model these connections. It's also called a graph. That's where the name comes from. So for example, Borg.base, which is a very simple application, has like 20 or so models in all. And when a user logs in and I'm building the view for his front end, then I would have to go and query all the different REST endpoints to build his view, which takes a lot of requests and is very slow. So GraphQL also solves that problem. And another pain point that Facebook was also discovering, for example, you're fetching a blog post from a REST API, and sometimes you only need the date and the title, sometimes you only need maybe the featured image, sometimes you need the full text, and REST doesn't have a straightforward way to define which fields you want for the current fetch, and with GraphQL, the client can decide which fields you want, but we will see all that. So this is a very nice picture that I stole from a tutorial that I can recommend, how to GraphQL. So it shows you how REST would do like a classic example of REST. So this could either be a website, a JavaScript application, or it could be a mobile app. So basically, we have a user. This user has posts and he has followers. So with HTTP, we have to make 3 separate requests. Zack, zack, always round turn, which can take a long time. So we're fetching the user, we get a response back. Then we're fetching the post, we get a response back. We're fetching the followers, and the same thing. So we have 3 requests. And then here, let's compare this to GraphQL. So in GraphQL, we also fetch this user, and then we are fetching some connected fields, models, and for example, we tell it we only want the last 3 followers that he has, and we only want the title. Instead of fetching the whole text, we can tell it exactly what we want. This is like the beauty of GraphQL, really. And here you see we only do 1 request, so it's 3 times faster. And this 1 request is also much smaller because it only has exactly the fields that we need in the front end. And this doesn't need any changes to the back end because we specify everything in the front end. So you don't really need to touch the back end a lot when you're developing the front end. Okay, now we're going to look into the core concepts of GraphQL. I'll make this rather quick, but we'll need it later. So everything starts with a type, which loosely maps to one database table or to one model that you have in Django. So I will be reusing the example from the beginning, which is like a person and a post. So you'll see that over and over again. So here you see we tell it we have a type. We call that type a post. And then you can define some scalar values. And if you put an exclamation mark, it means it's required. Then the more interesting thing is a query. So there are only 2 types of things you can do with GraphQL. You can do a query or a mutation. A query is like you're just getting data and you're not changing anything. And a mutation is almost everything else, like deleting stuff or updating it or creating it. So that's all a mutation. Because a query is almost the default, so you can omit the keyword. Then you give the name of the query, and then you give it the fields that you want. So in this example, we have all persons, and we want the name and the age, and it gives us just the data. Okay, when you add GraphQL to Django, it comes with a very nice, like a browser, like a small application that allows you to do some documentation. It's called GraphQL, so I'm running that here. Yeah. So here we can run our queries as well. For example, all persons, and it gives you the data. Very straightforward. Now the next one is mutations. Mutation means we're doing something, so it's every time I run it, something will change, so I'm not getting the same kind of data all the time. So I've prepared a small mutation here. I call it create person as well. Lisa. So we give it some arguments. The name is required. The age is required. We defined the data types before, and then when you run it, it says please authenticate. Because later I want to talk about security as well. So we will see how to log in a bit. First, let's look at the GraphQL a little bit. So basically, it's very useful for developing and for debugging. And also, after my project was online for a few months, some people, they came to ask me, they want to do some bulk action and they want to have an API. And I told them there's already an API. So I just made this public and made a link. And I made a small Python wrapper, and now they're just working happily with that. So you can just, for every GraphQL endpoint, you can just look here. It will tell you all the actions or all the queries you can do. It will tell you all the types. For example, I can look at the person type here. I can look at the fields. So this makes it very easy for, so basically it's auto-documenting. So it makes it very easy for me to get started. Or the mutations, for example, create person, login mutation. So this is all generated automatically. So you get the documentation for free, basically. All right, so we had mutation. Then what we have seen also, I'm not sure if you saw it, but of course you can use arguments, which is very useful to reuse your GraphQL queries, because you don't want to recreate your GraphQL queries for every single user. For example, if the user changes, or if you need a different blog post ID or whatever, then you just want to change this one thing. This is also kind of can be a protection against like SQL injections. So it's better only to replace the variables and not mess with the whole GraphQL query. And what I usually see in production projects, or what I do personally, I just keep this piece here. I just keep the query itself with arguments. I keep it in a separate file. And then in my application code, I just load the file. And I just replace the variables. So I never have to touch the GraphQL code. Then we also saw this before. This is also a very good feature of GraphQL. It's nesting. So, for example, we could have a related field in our blog post that's called author, and we can always ask it to fetch some related, like to fetch some fields of this related, like of this connected model. So I can, for example, in this example, we're fetching the name of the author. But for example, if the author has followers, I could just fetch that as well. So I'm going down 3 levels, 4 levels, as far as I want. Let's see how this looks like. New person. Oh yeah, here I'm using some variables. So again, you have to define the type of the variable and also if it's required. Because you could, for example, if you're using it in your application code and you don't pass the variable, it's just skipped. But if you make it a required variable, then it will do some checking that this variable is actually here. And then when we run it, we get an error again. So let's do the login mutation so we actually log in. This is very similar here. So we have the username, password string, we log in. And then the OK is just a true false, so we know if the login was successful. Okay, so now we're logged in. I'm using just cookie-based, so this is just using Django's cookie sessions. So it's very simple. I didn't add any code to Django. I'm getting this for free. So basically, the GraphQL is triggering Django to set the cookie in the client. And now the client can actually create stuff. For example, let's try to create our person here. And now it worked. So it created a new person. Then we ask it to return the ID. We don't need anything else here. But for example, we could also ask it to give back the name. Let's just make this Alice2, right? So we run it again. And now we get a new ID, and we also get the name back. So I have total freedom to see which fields I want to get. If I want nested fields, that's very nice. Then another feature that's that's upcoming and that will be very interesting for GraphQL is subscriptions. This is a similar use case as WebSockets are used today. I have to mention that not many GraphQL frameworks include support for this at the moment. So the Django Graphene framework has no support at the moment. So you have to use WebSockets for now. But I think the Apollo guys in Node.js, they're already supporting it. And I guess over time it will come to Django as well. What you can do with this is your client can subscribe to some events that are happening on the server. For example, if you have a chat application, you could subscribe to new chat messages. And then when there's a new chat message on the server, it gets pushed to the client. And usually this is implemented with WebSockets. But you don't have to worry about WebSockets if you use GraphQL because it's abstracted for you. Then the last thing I want to mention is fragments. Because sometimes it can be for example, if you have very large models with like 20, 30 fields, and maybe you need to fetch the same model in multiple queries, it can be very difficult to keep track of new fields that you're adding. So what you can do is you can make it a fragment, and then when you are fetching from a specific user, you can always use this fragment, and the fragment is like a list of fields that you want to retrieve for this user. Okay, now demo time. I made 2 sample applications for this. One is the backend, which is in Django, and the other one is the front end, which is in Vue.js. So let's look at Django first. So I guess there's who is a Django developer here? Quite a few. Okay, a few. So I guess you know this, right? This is like the most minimal example for models that you can have. So I have defined 2 models, person and post. I just defined 2 fields. These are mapped to the database. I'm just using the SQLite database here because we don't need much more. Then when you add GraphQL, there's one more file where you are having your, I shouldn't do that. So there's one more file where you can define your types, your queries, and your mutations. So this is this file. Defining types is very easy because you just link to the Django model. So it's only these 2 lines here. So by these 2 lines, it takes my database model, and then we find it again here. When we're looking at our schema, we see the query. So this maps directly back here. So here you see ID, name, age, and I have the post set because I made a foreign key in Django. And that's exactly this here. I have the name, I have the age, and here I have the foreign key, which maps back. And GraphQL is exactly reflecting this. Then some queries. So we have the all persons and all posts. As you can see, the writing style is a little bit different between JavaScript and Python. So there's some automatic conversion between like snake script, camel script, and so on. So basically, you define your GraphQL queries, and then you just have the resolver in Python. In this case, it's very simple. We're just returning all the Python instances of this model that we have, and that's it. Here we have the login mutation, which is also quite simple. So we have 2 custom arguments, the username and the password. Both are required. Then we just authenticate with the standard Django functions, and that's it. We got that. Okay, now let's see how it looks in the front end. Here I made a very simple Vue.js front end. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So the code is also here. Okay, anyone coding Vue.js? view here. Okay. So again, this is very simple. I only have one app file. So I have here my, the interesting stuff is here at the bottom. Maybe I should talk about GraphQL clients first. Oh, here we go. Okay, so there's like when Facebook originally released GraphQL, they also released a sample implementation in JavaScript called Relay. And many frameworks, they copied the style of Relay, but I don't think it's used much because there are better clients now. I think the most complete one for a big enterprise project is Apollo. They're also providing some backend frameworks and some front-end clients. And there are a couple of smaller ones if you have a small project. So for this demo, I picked GraphQL request, which is very simple. It doesn't have a lot of features, but it's great for just showing the implementation. All right. So basically, we give it the endpoint, the GraphQL endpoint. As we heard in GraphQL, as opposed to REST, there's only one endpoint all the time. It's always called GraphQL, and all the requests are sent there, no matter which mutation and which query. Then since I'm doing cookie-based authentication, I'm also telling it to include the cookie when it's sending the request. And these are just my fields that I need for Vue.js. Then I have a couple of methods here. So here's the getPerson query that we saw before. It's also implemented in Python. In this example, I'm inlining the GraphQL code, but for a bigger project, I don't recommend that, so it's better to keep it in a separate file. There are also some projects that allow you to write JavaScript and then turn it into GraphQL code. These are not very popular, but some people, they prefer them because they can do, they don't want to inline any strings, so they prefer to have JavaScript all the way. That's probably the reason. But for this example, it's okay to inline it. So basically, we have a long string, which is our GraphQL query. Then we give it the query. Then we sometimes have variables, but not in this case. Down here, we have some variables. For example, we pass it the username and the password. So these variables are replaced by the variables that we give it in JavaScript. Then let's see how it looks like. So we can just open the developer window, so we can see what's happening in the back. So now we press get persons, and it will run the GraphQL query. So this is also very nice to debug, because here we see our query, right? This is exactly what we wrote in JavaScript. And then we can also see the data that gets sent by GraphQL. And then Vue.js is just looping over it and inserting it into our template. So that's very straightforward. Then for this talk, I also added some login, because almost every application needs some kind of login. So here I have, let's look at this in Vue.js. So here we have the login function that's connected to the login button. It's just sending the username and the password, and then it's seeing if it was successful. And if there's an error, it will also show up. For example, we can put some random stuff here. Then it will tell us that the password is invalid. So let's put the right username and password, and we are logged in. And we can look at the cookie here. And we can see that we just have the standard Django session ID now here as a cookie. And that's it. So there's no extra tooling required to add login to GraphQL. It just works out of the box. And now we also have the permission to add a new person. So we add a Python guy here, 23, add person. Person was added. Then we can call this here again, and our new person should show up as well. And when we look at our network table, we see it's always calling the same GraphQL endpoint, and then it's sending some JSON data, and it's getting back some JSON data. Very straightforward and very easy to debug, because when there's any error in the backend, you also see the error here in the front end. Okay, so how to do authentication? I already mentioned a few things. So you cannot do it by endpoint as you would do in a REST API, because it all goes to the same endpoint. So you have to do it by query or by mutation, which is also okay. Let's see how this looks in Python. So create person, here we go. So you always get, as is normal in Django, you get the context. The context has the user, if the user is logged in, and then you can see if the user is not authenticated, then you just throw an error, and you just, yeah. If the user is logged in, you just continue with that. This could also be done with a decorator, which I didn't do here, but it's quite easy to add. Then you have, because GraphQL doesn't tell you how to do your implementation, it doesn't tell you to use WebSockets for subscriptions, it doesn't tell you to use cookies for authentication, so you have multiple options. In this example, I used a cookie, but some people also like to use web tokens, which is another option. I think there's a package for it to add web token authentication to GraphQL and Django. In this case, you probably send the token as a header, which can also be done, but it's more work than a simple cookie. There are arguments for and against both, so I won't. As with every new technology, there are some new security aspects to keep in mind that are not there with REST, I have to admit. So for example, because you can query, in theory, you could make circular queries by just, for example, if you have a user in the post, and the post has an offer, so you can just go in circles, and you can do like, you can go as deep as you want, and then attacker could also exploit this. So most GraphQL libraries, they will have like a protection to limit the query depth to like 10 or 20 levels, so the attacker cannot overload your web server. Unfortunately, this doesn't tell you anything about the complexity of the query, but this is a problem that REST also has, and throttling is also a problem from REST. This we already looked at. Okay, then short summary. So compared to REST, GraphQL solves a couple of problems that are not really solvable in REST, which is like that you're fetching too many fields, or that you cannot fetch related instances. And it drastically minimizes the number of HTTP requests that you need to do, which is, in my opinion, the biggest advantage, because you can populate your whole user interface with a single request, which is very fast. Then about the GraphQL scheme, we have seen the types to define a type, which is done almost automatically. Then we saw how to do queries, which is the default type, fields you want. Then the second type of queries you can do is mutations, which change data. And same as with a query, you can decide which fields you want back. For example, if you create a new model instance, you probably want the ID back. Then you can use arguments to make your GraphQL queries more reusable, to don't repeat it, to avoid writing the same GraphQL code again and again. Then you can do nesting, so you can fetch all the fields that you need of related instances. Then subscriptions, maybe in 1 or 2 years we'll have subscription support, which will make a lot of different kinds of apps easy to write. Then implementations. So I didn't talk about this a lot, but Graphene is currently the default implementation for Django. Graphene is like its own project, and on top of that, there's like a very thin wrapper that integrates it with Django. Then for the client side, Apollo is probably the default for most, recommended for most larger projects, but for smaller projects, you can also use one of the much smaller clients like I did here. And when you're already a Django developer, you can pretty much reuse almost everything you know and everything you use. You don't have to change your authentication or anything. Okay, so now questions, or if I was if I was telling bullshit, then just let me know. If there are more experienced Django developers,